So we've talked about recovery being a really important aspect of training adaptation. The concept that certain times of the year you would emphasize recovery to a greater extent than others, i.e. specific prep phase as we move into tapers and competition periods. But in the general prep phase, the focus is actually probably more on training, stressing, and adapting with more limited recovery, although basic recovery principles would need to be covered. Maybe we could just shift gears a little bit and talk about some very specific recovery strategies that are being utilized in elite sport, and just dig into those a little bit going forward. And I think maybe the first and most fundamental one for us to talk about is nutrition. Maybe you could hit us with your top three nutrition tips for ensuring that athletes are adequately recovering after training.
Yeah, I'll give you 4.
Give me 4. Even better.
I have 4.
Okay.
So you really serve 3 masters immediately post-training, and that's rehydration, carbohydrate for glycogen synthesis, and protein for protein synthesis.
Yes.
But the 4th one I wanted to emphasize is timing.
Okay, perfect.
And so, did you want me to step through it very quickly? Each of those? Okay.
I think, why don't you walk us through those, and I might just
jump in now and
periodically poke you with a question here or there.
That sounds good.
Okay.
So, I'll start with rehydration. Obviously, during training, athletes sweat. A certain amount of body weight sweat loss is normal. 1 to 2% of a body weight loss during training is typical. If athletes are losing more than 1 to 2% of their body weight, they aren't drinking enough. If they're losing less than that, they're probably drinking too much. So because 1 liter of sweat equals 1 kilogram, you can very quickly get an idea of the amount of kilograms and therefore the amount of sweat that they lost. And the rule is for every 1 kilogram of body weight loss, you drink 1.5 times that amount of fluid. So for 1 kilogram body weight loss, the recommended rehydration is 1.5 liters.
And that's post-exercise, Trent.
That's post-exercise.
And that's because, I guess, you continue to lose fluid even after you've stopped exercising. So to fully replenish, you need to drink more than you've lost.
In about 4 to 5 hours later, and that 1.5 liters sounds like a lot, but that you would take that in over a couple of hours post-training. And then if we measured your body weight about 4 hours later, you'd be back to neutral, because obviously during that 4-hour period, you're still going to the bathroom.
Yeah, fair enough.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes where people lose track of this a little bit is they don't consider the absolute size of the athlete.
Right.
And so a really big athlete might lose a lot more absolute sweat than a small little endurance athlete, for example. So I guess that has to be taken into account.
Absolutely. So when it comes to sweat body weight losses or even weight changes over time, I always think about percent changes.
Great.
Because then it's relative to the athlete's size. So you have a 50 kilogram female marathon runner who loses 1 kilogram, that's 2% of her body weight. You have a 100 kilogram rower who loses 1 kilogram, that's 1%. So it's very easy to figure out. For a big rower in Italy, pre-Olympics, they'll come off the water losing 2 to 3 kilograms. That would freak out some people who work with 50 kilogram athletes, but in fact it's only 2%.
It's not much.
It's not much for a big guy.
So for coaches and athletes just to monitor this, it really is just a matter of weighing their athlete with an accurate scale pre and post exercise.
Exactly.
And obviously, if they're training in different environmental conditions, that can also have an impact, Trent. For example, if it's very hot, you might expect 50% more fluid loss, for example.
Absolutely. And so being accurate in measuring these things is probably more important early in a camp when you've switched environmental conditions. You've gone from rainy, cold Victoria to Sacramento next week, right? And all of a sudden it's warm, or just being more diligent about that early in a camp helps you correct those deficits on hydrational recovery.
Okay, so the importance of rehydrating post-exercise, you've emphasized that.
So the second one I mentioned was carbohydrate for post-exercise carbohydrate glycogen repletion. So glycogen is your storage form of carbohydrate in the muscle. It's your high-octane fuel during training. Whenever you're over about 70% of VO2 max, which is the vast majority of all athletes are,
Yeah.
you're burning mainly carbohydrate to produce energy. And so even in the weight room, you can burn through a lot of glycogen in your muscles. If you find variability in training and training intensity tailing off during the end of the week, a lot of times it has to do with carbohydrate intakes, as you aren't replenishing your glycogen effectively enough. So the rule there, and there's probably no macronutrient that's been as researched as much in the nutrition field as carbohydrate and glycogen. And so this is very well researched, is you need about 1 to 1.5 grams of carbohydrate per kilogram body weight for the first several hours post-training to maximize glycogen resynthesis. So a 100 kilogram rower multiplied by about 1.5, he needs 150 grams of carbohydrate spread over that first several hour period immediately post-training to maximize this effect.
Right on, and the timing is the fourth thing you're going to talk about, I know,
Yeah.
but getting that in relatively quickly.
I'll touch timing here.
Okay.
I collected about 8 or 9 of the glycogen resynthesis studies a few years ago and looked at timing to replenish glycogen. And basically, if you can get in carbohydrates straight away, you can replenish 100% your muscle glycogen stores in the order of about 20 to 24 hours.
By the next day.
By the next day.
Yeah.
If you wait 2 hours to take carbohydrate, it takes about 48 hours to replenish your glycogen. So it takes 2 days to then recover if you wait past 2 hours. So the emphasis for carbohydrate and for protein and for hydration is immediate post-training timing.
Yes. Okay.
is very important. In that first 15-20 minutes, you should be starting these processes as a normal part of your routine.
So Trent, you talk about the volume of carbohydrate that needs to be
Yes.
taken in the minutes to hours
Yep.
post-exercise. I think sometimes coaches and athletes, they'll hear I need 100 grams of carbohydrate. They won't be sure where to get that from, what kind of carbohydrate they should eat. Is it fast carbs,
Yep.
slow carbs? Can I use a carbohydrate electrolyte drink, which I would suggest doesn't have enough carbohydrate in it
Yep.
for their needs? Can you give us some practical ideas of what that might look like?
Absolutely. So 1 liter of most commercial sports drinks contains about 60 or 65 grams of carbs because it's a 6.5% solution.
Right.
For some athletes, smaller athletes, that'll do it.
Be okay, yeah.
Most of our rowers would then need to drink 2 liters of that. So we augment the carbohydrate intake also with energy bars. Every commercial product in Canada is required to have the carbohydrate labeled. So you just have to
Just read the grams off the label.
Read the grams off the label.
Yeah.
Dried dates, they're an excellent carbohydrate source. One dried date a big dried date can have 10 to 12 grams of carbs in one date. There's lots of free online places where you can type in the food. CalorieCount.com, for example, you just type it in and it gives you the carbohydrate content of typical foods.
Right.
The key, though, is to have those dried dates with you in your bag where you're training, or to have that energy bar in your bag where you're training, because again, the timing is of the essence.
People talk about slow carbs versus fast carbs a
Right.
lot. Glycemic index. How important is that, Trent, during recovery?
Yeah, there's a lot of research on that, and to be honest, if an athlete has 24 hours to recover, there's a couple of good studies out of the AIS showing that whether you take a fast carb or high glycemic index carbohydrate, which is basically refined sugar,
Yeah.
versus a slow carb, which is your more complex carbohydrate, maybe has more fiber, or it comes in a meal because the fat and protein in the meal slows out the release of the carbohydrates. Whether you take a fast carb or slow carb, if you have 24 hours to recover, it doesn't matter.
Perfect.
Glycogen is fine. In short recovery windows, 3 to 4 hours, it does appear that the faster acting high glycemic index carbohydrate will replenish glycogen a little bit quicker. So for those athletes that are doing doubles or triples, it becomes relevant.
Yeah, I think that's a great tip, because certainly we know in elite sport we have athletes that are training 2 to 3 times a day, and it might not be, it might be resistance training plus 2 sport specific, energy system type training sessions a day. So having some sense about what carbohydrates to eat post training is important. We could get into a whole other discussion about training with and without carbohydrates during exercise, which we won't do.
No.
But maybe that's another topic.
In a year or two, when we get a bit more information, we can talk about that.
For sure. Okay, so we've talked about hydration. We've talked about carbohydrate. Carbs. What about protein?
So that third master that you have to kind of satisfy is protein and protein synthesis. And a lot of people think about protein and think about the big muscle guy in the weight room. But remember, even in endurance athletes, where capillaries are really important and mitochondria are really important, those are proteins.
Yeah.
So we can now, by taking a muscle biopsy sample, can actually measure muscle protein synthesis, but we can actually measure mitochondrial protein synthesis as well. And lo and behold, maybe not surprising, you have to consume protein to also optimize mitochondrial turnover and mitochondrial protein synthesis. So protein's important not only for the big guy in the weight room, but also for the 50 kilogram endurance athlete. And in fact, I know it's a bit of a hypothesis here, and I know some extra data that may come out to support this soon, is endurance athletes, because of how much they train, and you use a little bit of protein to oxidize during training. If you're training 4 or 5 hours a day, sure, you're only oxidizing 5% of your total energy from protein, but when you multiply that out by the number of minutes, endurance athletes might actually, on a relative basis, even have greater protein needs than the muscle head in the weight room.
Well, that's a great point, and I think what I take from this discussion is, and we talk about mitochondrial adaptation. Mm-hmm. Well, mitochondria are the powerhouse of the cell, so anybody that requires aerobic energy at a high rate needs more mitochondria.
Yeah. You can never have enough.
Never have enough of those babies. Same with capillarization. And then the idea that, actually we do burn carbohydrate as the primary source of fuel during continuous endurance exercise, but protein is also a fuel.
Yeah.
What about the fact, like impact sports versus non-impact sports? So if you're a runner, a lot of impact, maybe more muscle damage than you might see in a swimmer or a rower, where it's more concentric. Do you think that plays a role in your opinion, Trent? Or
on protein?
Yes, on protein.
There could be. So if we measured in the blood a marker of protein, say 3-methylhistidine, which is a measurement of protein breakdown, degradation into the blood, or creatine kinase.
Right.
3-methylhistidine is more specific to protein. When you do weight-dependent, more muscle-damaging exercise, like running or downhill running, compared to swimming, it is certainly higher.
Turns over faster.
So there's more muscle damage, but muscle damage and protein turnover is a good thing.
Absolutely.
Because you're getting rid of the old proteins and then going to resynthesize in new proteins.
So that plasticity is really what we're talking about when we talk about training adaptation.
Exactly.
Right.
So when it comes back to protein synthesis, compared to carbohydrate, we know very little about protein synthesis. It's much more, it's the new kid on the block in terms of research.
Yeah.
But there has been, right here in Canada at McMaster University, a series of probably 15 or 20 studies over the last few years that have done a really good job at looking at the amount and type of protein to maximize muscle protein synthesis. And the take-home message right now is that you need about 0.3 grams of protein per kg body weight immediately post-training as an acute amount. So for a 70 kilogram athlete, it's about 20 grams. If you're a 50 kilogram athlete, it's about 15 grams of protein. And if you're 100 kilograms multiplied by 0.3, it's 30 grams of
So
protein.
that could be a couple of protein bars, or if you're a smaller athlete, it's maybe one protein.
Exactly.
Or a sports bar.
Or a sports bar.
Yeah. And you can read that off the label.
A big glass of milk
might
has around 12 to 15, so you're almost there. With carbs, we're like 60 to 80 to 100 grams, somewhere in there. With protein, we're talking more like 15 to 30 grams of protein. That's in that 2 to 3 hour post-training. That's not the amount that you need for the day.
No, it's just a dose you need to recover.
To recover, correct.
Okay, great. Now, you did mention type of protein, so maybe we could just dig into that for a moment. And I think of the chocolate milk commercials that I see on TV, which is being obviously promoted as a recovery drink. It has carbohydrate in it, and it has protein together. Is milk protein a good source of protein, Trent?
So we're getting into an area that's quite controversial.
I know. It's
beyond just what's in milk, but it seems like everyone and their brother is lactose intolerant these days, and there truly are athletes that are lactose intolerant. And I think that there's some people that have pushed that so far that no one should drink milk. We didn't evolve to drink milk, and there's that whole discussion that's maybe for another time and place. But I will say that if you're in Kenya, the Kenyan runners drink about 1 liter to 1.5 liters of milk a day, and they seem to be running okay these days.
Yeah, they're pretty good.
So I think it's an individual choice that you need to make and how your gut reacts to milk or not. I'm lactose intolerant, but I truly have a family history of it. So saying that, there was a good study done 2 years ago at McMaster where they had guys come in and do resistance exercise 3 times. And immediately after the weight training, they took in it was about 20 grams of whey or 20 grams of casein, and both of those are milk proteins. If you take milk and spin it down, you can separate it into 2 major constituents, which are whey and casein. Whey is a fast protein. It comes into the bloodstream very quickly and has higher branched chain amino acids and leucine. Casein is a slower protein. It comes into the bloodstream slower. It contains a little less branched chain amino acids and less leucine. So then the third one they did was soy protein.
Right, so plant-based protein.
A plant-based protein. And then they measured muscle protein synthesis over 4 hours. And they found, and there's now been 2 studies to confirm this, they found whey protein best for muscle protein synthesis, then soy, then casein.
Okay, it's interesting, yeah.
So the idea being that whey protein, because it comes into the bloodstream very fast, it contains a lot of leucine, which we believe is the trigger to turn on muscle protein synthesis.
Yeah.
It's the light switch in the factory, so to speak,
to
make new proteins in the assembly line. That leucine and that leucine trigger and the rate of increase of leucine in the blood appears to be a real stimulus to maximize recovery post-exercise. So if you're looking to gain muscle, then a whey-based protein is best. Now going back to your milk question, lo and behold, Mother Nature, milk has both whey and casein, as I said earlier. It also contains fluids. And it also contains natural sodium, and it also contains carbohydrate.
Yeah, it's interesting. So actually my next question for you, and we'll probably leave it there on the nutrition side, is when you start to combine carbohydrate and protein, for example, into your recovery food, which obviously is what we see in a lot of the sports bars. It's what happens when you eat I shouldn't call it real food.
Food.
Self-prepared food. You have a mixture of protein and carbohydrate. Is there some advantage to bringing in protein and carbohydrate at the same time, for example?
Yeah, for muscle protein synthesis, there does not seem to be an advantage.
Okay.
So as long as you get the amount of protein that you need, adding carbs on top of it, yes, you will drive insulin up higher, but the threshold for insulin in healthy people is actually quite low for protein.
Right. You'll bring it in anyways.
Yeah, you'll get insulin up enough just with the protein.
Okay.
Because there's certain amino acids that release insulin.
Absolutely.
And so there's a lot of thought that driving insulin up is anabolic and helps with protein synthesis, and that's complete hogwash, actually.
Okay, great.
That's a myth. Now, for muscle glycogen resynthesis, the carbs are absolutely fundamental. And there are a couple of well-done studies about 10 years ago showing that if you, with protein, can drive that insulin up even a little bit higher, instead of taking 24 hours to replenish muscle glycogen, you can drop that down to about 18 with a combination of carbs and protein.
What about a mixture of different types of carbs? Maybe using different carbohydrate transporters to increase the rate of absorption and replenishment.
To enhance recovery.
Exactly.
Right. So on the very acute level, so glucose has one transporter, fructose has another transporter in the gut, and it appears that the gut and the GI tract are the limiting kind of the brick wall to getting carbs into the system. There are a couple of interesting acute studies, one done by a former colleague of mine, showing that liver glycogen resynthesis is enhanced by using glucose-fructose blends.
Right.
There's one study with muscle glycogen resynthesis that didn't show a difference, but I think it probably had to do with measurement sensitivity and the timing of when they took their biopsies. So I tend to say a combination of things post-training are the way we've evolved to eat.
And making sure you have the right number, right amount of carbs,
Yep,
right amount of protein, and then timing, get it in quickly.
And fluids, and those are your key points.
Perfect.
Yeah,
that's great.